Good morning, my friends. I am indeed Donald Welch, and for those of you who don't know me, because we have now looks like friends from all over the world joining us, I am the Mission Center Financial Officer for Greater Pacific Northwest. It is my pleasure today to bring you a commentary on the book of Mark, chapters 1, verses 21 through 28, and my thoughts about recognizing the Holy One. But first, one character criticism of myself. If this were a 12-step program, this is how I'd be introducing myself today. Just like I said, my name is Donald Welch, and I'm an insufferable scripture snob. It comes as an unfortunate side effect of my graduate studies in language and religion, and it may sound like a strange way to introduce myself today, but I promise that it will make sense as we get more into the scripture and you learn how I identify with it. Other than that, the most important thing you need to know about me, I'm typing into the chat box, is my contact information. Like I said, I love scripture. And when I say something today, if it challenges you or it comforts you or it may be something new for you today, if you would like to continue this conversation, I am more than happy to sit down and talk about scripture texts with you. It's one of the things I love most. We can talk about favorite scriptures. It doesn't even have to be about today, but feel free. It's fun for me. And if you like to converse about the Bible, I'd be happy to join you. So let's start today with what I love, the scripture in question. And we're going to start with the author, with Mark. Mark is not a good writer. In the space of a single page, Mark reports that Jesus came onto the scene, mentions John the Baptist, is baptized by him, is tempted by Satan in 2 sentences, by the way. I'd like to know a little bit more about that. He begins his ministry, gathers his first disciples, and then the scripture in question. In 1 page, Mark is super efficient. It's like he went to Walmart and they only had 1 scroll of papyrus for him to buy, and he had to write down everything he knew about Jesus in that 1 scroll. It's like, this is just what he does. He keeps things rolling, and he uses the word immediately 35 times in a 16-chapter gospel. Even a 5th grader could tell you that's too many times to use 1 word in an essay. Personally, I would like a little bit more detail, the kind of detail that Matthew and Luke use. But instead of using Matthew's and Luke's gospels to fill in the gaps, I would like to instead use Mark's own scripture skeleton and paint you a picture using a combination of historical study and my own imagination. So here we go. This is the scripture in question according to Donald Welch. Jesus, born in Nazareth, in the highlands about 10 miles southwest of Galilee, finds himself walking along the shores of that sea, a freshwater lake upstream and north of the Dead Sea along the Jordan River. There he gathers some of his disciples who were career fishermen. Likely they were fishing for tilapia. When he enters the city of Capernaum on the north shore and goes to a synagogue to do some teaching. Most of the cities the size of Capernaum had a local synagogue of their own. And this was probably the synagogue that his newly recruited fishermen disciples frequented, if at all. These local synagogues were typically places where privileged local Jews could study and learn from local rabbis and elders, maybe even Pharisees and scribes. But only the men were allowed to learn the Torah. So it's not a surprise to me that when Jesus starts to teach at the invitation of one of these fishermen, that he's challenged. The scripture states that the challenger had an unclean spirit and asked him, "What have you to do with us? Jesus of Nazareth, which is a question that immediately refers my brain to another scripture from John, chapter 146, when Nathan asks Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And in response, the man with the unclean spirit, Jesus says, "Be quiet and come out of him," with an exclamation point. This is not a quiet statement. It was an adamant command. And immediately, as I've already mentioned is the case in much of Mark, the unclean spirit left the man who was challenging Jesus, but not before he fell into convulsions and was left crying loudly. This is where you're supposed to pause for dramatic effect. Everyone who witnessed the event was amazed at the expulsion, and then they left. And they decided from that moment on that Jesus was indeed good enough to teach at the synagogue of Capernaum, and they began to spread stories about Jesus from there, and his fame spread. So I'm going to ask you to participate in kind of an informal spiritual practice. Just as I just mentioned a whole lot of characters. Jesus, the fishermen disciples, a couple of other disciples. I mentioned rabbis, scribes, Pharisees, elders, students, and the women who weren't allowed to study. I even mentioned Mark, the writer. And I want you to for a moment, to take a moment and close your eyes, just actually close your eyes, and put yourself in the context of this story with everybody else. And I'm going to ask you some questions. First, I want you to identify with which character you feel most close. Which one do you identify with? And then with the eye of your mind closed, I want you to imagine the scene as I read the actual scripture to you. Please keep in mind the following questions while I'm reading. Where is everybody located? What kind of senses can you employ by listening to the scripture? Are there any smells? Are there any sounds? Are there any images that are not included? And perhaps most importantly, what feelings come to the surface while you are in character? So now while you keep your eyes closed, I'm going to read the scripture in its entirety as Flo already did, piece by piece. Thank you, Flo. This is the book of Mark, chapter 1, 21 through 28 from the New Revised Standard Version, and it's entitled The Man with the Unclean Spirit. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, O Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying with a loud voice, came out of him. They were amazed, and they kept asking one another, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." At once his fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And you may open your eyes. Now, if it were a prayer meeting, like a Wednesday night prayer meeting after this spiritual discipline, we would take turns. And we'd ask about your experiences, and you'd be given a chance to say which character you identified with. I invite you to continue that journey as today goes. But today, given the Zoom worship and the fact that not everyone can share, I'm just going to share with you my testimony and why it is that I relate so well with this scripture. And in particular, I relate to the man with the unclean spirit. When I was 26, I was pretty cocky about my own faith. I had just taken a position with the church in Alaska, which is why it's so good to see all these Alaskan faces here today. And I was invited to an event in Alabama, Gulf Shores in particular. Now, Gulf Shores is a beautiful place. We had a house right on the beach. And when I was invited to this event, I had a similar response to the man with the unclean spirit. What good can come out of Alabama? To which I responded to my apostle at the time, who was Dale Luffman. And I said, I don't really want to go. And Dale said to me, you don't understand. This is an invitation. This is a command. You are going to Gulf Shores, Alabama. And so I went with a completely closed mind. I swam in the ocean. I participated in the workshops, but it wasn't until one particular worship where God smacked me up beside the head and told me that I was being arrogant. Now, being a good Northwestern, as many of you are, you may have a similar perspective of me. The South isn't someplace I would want to live. There's a culture that I don't identify with. And there's a lot of people, even within our own church, that I don't agree with. And so it was during one of these worships, this worship that I told you God smacked me, that I actually interrupted a man who was leading worship, who had just said something that I wholeheartedly disagreed with. And it's the height of hubris to interrupt a worship just to correct somebody who's leading. I know that I don't take kindly to that myself, because it has happened to me on a time or two. And when another man stood up to defend him, I realized how disruptive I was being in the moment. I realized that I didn't have to agree with him, but I did have to listen for God. So there came a time in the worship when we were supposed to pray for one another. It was kind of a free-flowing kind of thing that you don't see a lot in the Northwest, actually, where we were to wander around the room and stop and pray with people whom you felt that God was telling you to pray for. And so I took his instructions, feeling way outside my comfort zone, and I did it. I went over to a woman who I thought Jesus was telling me to talk to, and I prayed for her, and then I sat back down and said, done, no more. Okay, I did what I was supposed to. And it was in that moment when another woman, Doris Kelly was her name, came over to me to pray for me. And I sat there dutifully as her hands and the hands of another partner came over, and Doris put her hands on my head and another woman put her hands on my hand, and she prayed for me. And I don't remember what Doris prayed about, but I do very much remember the conversation that we had afterwards. See, I'd never met Doris before, but she came to me in a time of my life when I was very much certain about the service to God that I wanted to give, but my wife was not, and she wanted something else. And Doris flat out said to me after the prayer, she sat next to me and she said, how does your wife feel about what you're doing? So Doris had this insight into my mind in that moment, just like Jesus did with the man with the unclean spirit. And she was able to pierce right to the matter of fact. Earlier in the scripture, there was a prayer about, or not a prayer, but a statement of liturgy about mental illness. And when it comes to understanding the man with the unclean spirit, I don't even have to go that far. I mean, I understand mental illness, but I also understand being a perfectly normal person and having an unclean spirit. So that I can't see the divine one. I can't see it just because it's outside of my context, because it's not what I expected to hear. It's not what I expected to see when I went to Alabama. I was shocked, even exercised in that moment. And I was able to understand that God was all around me, just as he is all around you. So I want to wrap up, but I have a few points to make before I do. Something that I want you to remember as this week progresses. Number one, please know that you cannot live isolated from the divine. If you're like me and you need help. Nay, sometimes you need exorcism to recognize how God is working in your life. Do not be isolated more than is required. Seek counsel from others because your faith is best expressed in a community of people. Number 2, realize that when it comes to point number 1, that I am speaking to the choir. Most of you can probably already know the power of community because that is why you are here. Instead, understand that the people who need this message the most are not here. You need to seek them out. And finally, and probably most importantly, seek out things that are different from you. When the man with the unclean spirit saw Jesus, he couldn't accept him, probably because Jesus was teaching something then different than what he had grown accustomed to hear in his synagogue. Don't read scripture to reinforce your preconceived notions. There's a reason why the truth is sometimes associated with a knife or a hot coal in other parts of the scripture. And that's because the truth hurts. It makes us uncomfortable. So maybe the next time you hear something that makes you uncomfortable, look for Jesus in it and see if he's there. So that's it. I'm a short speaker. I like to make my point and sit down while I'm in my prime. So I'd like to thank you all for entertaining the words of a scripture snob and this confession, and I hope it gives you enough spiritual food to make it through to your next week. Be well, and remember to keep in touch with me if you want to continue this conversation.